Vedanta siddhanta nirukti resha brahmaiva jivaham sakalam jagatcha akanda rupa stiti reva moksho brahmadvitiye shrutayaha pramanam om shantihi shantihi shantihi. It is the sure and certain conclusion of the Vedanta that all is Brahman. Time, space, living beings, and the world. Living in constant recognition of this fact is what is called enlightenment. Brahman is pure and perfect, and one without a second. And the revealed scriptures are the apt and final proof of this fact. Om peace, peace, peace. Om te dhyan yoga nugata pasyan devatma shaktim svagunair nagudim yaha karnani nikilani tani kalatma yuktanya adidishtat yekaha. Om shantihi shantihi shantihi. Practicing the yoga of meditation, the ancient seers beheld the divine being in everything, existing everywhere, which though veiled by all her own modes of nature, was nevertheless one and indivisible, and which had been incomprehensible to them earlier, due to the limitation of their own intellects. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Sahana, Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvi Navaditamastu Ma Vidvishovahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman, a reality, protect us. May Brahman sustain us. May Brahman illumine our thinking consciousness. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, or with the teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, and may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om. Welcome everyone here live in our SRV ashram classroom, and to all of the devotees and students joining us on live streaming. We are starting into a series of 3 classes, which will be interrupted by our Hawaii retreat after 2 classes. So there'll be 2 straight Sundays of live streaming now, today's being on Tibetan Buddhism and Vedanta. Next week's being on Zen Buddhism and Vedanta. And then our weekend retreat, and then the fourth weekend from now we'll have the final Buddhism and Vedanta class. So that's what's in store for this particular series, and you're all welcome, your friends are welcome, and we invite you to spread the word about the Dharma teachings that are going forth from SRV associations in its 3 centers, in Oregon, in San Francisco, and here in Hawaii. Now, we have just concluded a Dharma visit to the mainland, the West Coast, and we've just returned recently, so we are starting into this day honoring the unity of Buddhism and Vedanta. As Swami Vivekananda used to say, there's really no difference between them at all, essentially. The teachings, the Dharma teachings, you'll find to be almost exact. Of course, that's no surprise since Lord Buddha was an Indian seer. Probably the main differences you'll find is in the languages, because even though Buddha was 550 years before Christ, nevertheless, that's a very recent period of time when you compare it to the 5,000 to 7,000 or maybe even 10,000 years before Christ period, where the Vedic rishis were worshipping, and where the 4 portions of Vedanta, of the Vedas, came forth, the rites and rituals, the songs, the forest dwellers, and then finally the Upanishads, which we call specifically Vedanta. And over that long span of time, we find most of that lore being proposed to us and taught to us in Sanskrit. But by the time it reached Buddha's time, we were looking in terms of Pali, a derivative of Sanskrit, that we found many of the teachings of Buddha coming to us in that strain. So we find that there's that one difference then amongst the 2 philosophies, but we also find that since he was an Indian seer, and it took some time for his message to spread across the world, as I often like to say, without raising a finger, what to speak of raising a sword, Buddhism marched non-violently with ahimsa and with the denial of animal sacrifice and killing, and in a very peaceful and a very effective way over centuries, from India to Tibet and to China, eventually to Japan. That's called Dhyan, Chan, and Zen. We'll talk about that next week in our teachings on Zen Buddhism and Vedanta. Basically, those 3 words out of those 3 periods, Sanskrit, Pali, and Japanese, mean the same thing, meditation. It's a path of meditation, and so it sort of rather supports what I've been speaking about lately, that there's really only one prime use for meditation, and that is for seeing God face to face, is having darshan with the deity. And as far as many of the darshanas, that is the clear ways of seeing, concur with each other, Tantra, Vedanta, Yoga, Sankhya, Buddhism, and others, then they find this common ground in the yoga practice of meditation. And that is, yoga being used in a wide sense of the term. And that's why we find this one word, Dhyan Yoga, or meditation, which I chanted just now. They Te Dhyan Yoga Nugata Pasyan, and they beheld the Devatma Shaktim, the Devatma, the divine Atman, Shakti, divine energy, existing in everything. And they hadn't been able to see her because of the limitation of their own intellects, but as soon as they began to understand the difference between the intellect and intelligence, or we might say nowadays between the brain and the mind, then they begin to have these very deep insights. And that led to their beautiful divine remembrance. And that divine remembrance is half the battle as far as enlightenment goes, as we were just chanting. That remembrance is half a way to enlightenment. So one has to simply remember their divine nature, and then move inwards in a series of internal, we used to call it inward ascension, into the realization of various principles, that cosmic principles that are existing inside of oneself, starting with the 5 gross elements and the 5 senses, and then moving in another set of 5s to the subtle senses, and another set of 5s to the 5 pranas, and another set of 5s to the fivefold mind. Pretty soon you count off some 24 or 25 cosmic principles, which ancient Samkhya philosophy in India enumerated for us. And that's a quintuplication process that makes you a knower of the cosmos. And if you come to know the cosmos, then your path in and out of rebirth becomes smooth. When we talk about that in terms of Tibetan Buddhism, then we have some living proofs of those today. And my teacher, the Karmapa, Dalai Lama, has taken some 13 or 14 reincarnations consciously, and teachers like Jamgon Khamtrul Rinpoche, whom I will show you a teaching from him here today, and Kalda Rinpoche, who came to the islands and used to give us teachings here throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And you find that Tibetan Buddhist lineage is very unique in that it focuses on this teaching of reincarnation and karma, and therefore brings it into focus for us. Some of the other darshanas tend to leave it a little bit in the background of things and focus more on the divine reality itself, called Atman or Brahman, or Tathagatagarbha is another way of saying that. The Buddha mentioned it, or Pragyaparam was another way he called it, supreme intelligence. So we get back to that idea of intelligence flowing outward from the great mind of God, Mahat, and then taking on certain stations, sort of like satellite stations on the way to a far distant planet or a far distant source. And this consciousness trickles down into these various stations. And so if one is in knowledge of these 24 cosmic principles, one becomes a knower of the cosmos, and that's penultimate to becoming a knower of Brahman. It's a very important gap in our learning right now in Western culture, and it's attended by 2 great missing links. One of them is called prana, or divine energy, this life force, sometimes they call it. And also this lack of remembrance of our chain of rebirths. So when we talk about Tibetan Buddhism and Vedanta, then we're talking about a whole cross-section of humanity that got enlightened as to the nature of this succession of rebirths and began to court the idea. It was an idea in the beginning, it eventually became a relative truth to them, that the soul comes again and again many times and takes on forms. The soul here, of course, we would mean the mind. We have to be clear about that. So, when we're have been brought up in a Christian tradition, it's not, the soul doesn't go from heaven to earth to hell in Vedanta. That means Atman doesn't move, or Brahman doesn't move. It's stationary and everywhere and all-pervasive. So we have to keep that sacrosanct and pure as it is. But something else is moving inside of us due to the power of this Devatma Shaktim. And via that power, everything moves. Man does not live by bread alone. There's another power that's coursing through the veins and through the nerves. And not only through the gross veins and nerves, but through the subtle veins and nerves too, called nadis. the yogis know about those. The scientists and the doctors and so forth only know about the gross sheaths and the gross nerves. So these subtle nerves are carrying an energy that by gradation becomes finer and finer as a person moves in towards the source of his being. And that's synonymous to explaining also how these cosmic principles get animated. They're stations at first, but when they become attended by Shakti, or further out in a more gross vibration, they become attended by prana, or furthest out in the realm of atomic principles, they become attended by particles. Then you're talking about variation that's different levels of vibration at different levels of intensity. And time, space, causality, living beings in the world, as we just chanted, are all accompanied by that divine energy. It's just a matter of how fine the mechanism is. So in this class I wanted to show you a chart that I just composed yesterday, and in fact I wasn't able to blow it up for the chart stand, so I made copies of all of it for you. These are just on loan, but maybe you can pass those out.
Yes.
And then I do have a copy of it on camera for the live streaming audience. It's called The Palette of Conscious Future Lives. And this is an ideal that we want to pursue. It might be a new idea to some people. To those in this room, I doubt it's a new idea. But nonetheless, it's something that we need to deepen our knowledge around and intensify our practice about, so that we can put it in the realm of not only possibility, but probability. And so I thought to myself, in this teaching that is going with it, which is going to be called the Bardo States of Tibetan Buddhism, Teachings on the Bardo States. That's a Tibetan chart I will show in conjunction with this more Vedantic chart called The Palette of Conscious Future Lives. And we'll begin to see what the body-mind mechanism is capable of and what its possibilities are, and take a closer inspection at that divine energy, Devatma Shaktim, that we just chanted, is that it attends upon it. Divine Mother of the Universe, we call. Now, Tibetan Buddhism, in some of these charts that are here for us to look at, like the charts on the divine links and the charts on the Bardo states and the charts on the Mahamudra, they call that divine energy Vajravahini. So that's Divine Mother in the tradition, and a deity inside which you contemplate upon and have visions of, and who helps you. And in Vedanta, we would call that Shakti, Devatma Shakti, as we were just saying, or we'd call it Mother Kali, or Mother Durga, or Mother Tara. Actually, Mother Tara is a good example of a goddess that goes both ways, that is, both to Vedanta and to Buddhism. She's the compassionate Divine Mother, and when I went to Karmapa, he gave me initiation into both the green and the white Tara, and gave me the mantras for them. So I started practicing that in conjunction with my Vedantic studies. So the wonderful thing that began to occur to me is the similarity, even maybe the essential unity between these two goddesses, Kali and Tara. Later on, I found out that there were certain songwriters, devotees in India, who had written songs proposing the same thing. They used the words Kali, Tara, Durga interchangeably, as if they were the same goddess, and I began to occur to me the idea that they are the same goddess, and along with hundreds and thousands of other manifestations of the goddess in different religious traditions, who always seems to be sort of behind the scenes. That's why you have that the beautiful songs that are sung by some of the devotees of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. Swami Abhedananda wrote, Rajapatavrite nicham sharada jnanadaite papebhyona sadaraksha kripamayi namostute kripamayi namostute. Kripamayi means full of grace, Divine Mother. Lajapatavritti nicham means in modest veil. She's always appearing, or as the case may be, not always appearing, because she has that modest veil over her. She moves about, as Sri Ramakrishna said, like a village cat covered with ashes, concealing her true color. So that Divine Mother that appears both in the Tibetan tradition and in the Vedanta tradition also appears in the Zen tradition, which we will be speaking about next week, called there Pragyaparamita, you know, the beautiful Diamond Cutter Sutra and all those Mother of the Buddhas, and the wisdom that comes forth from them is very profound, even has sent beings into higher states of awareness simply by reading those scriptures, what to speak of even contemplating them. Just hearing them for the first time brings one into a high state of awareness. So this chart in front of you then is my attempt at painting a picture, you might say, or teaching all of us how to paint a picture of a future life, which is going to be full of awareness, full of consciousness. I want to start in the middle. Those of you who are looking at the chart, and if it's on the screen for the live streaming audience, there's a quote I selected from Lord Vashishta, Vashishta's Yoga. He says, "Ego plus mind plus intelligence, and adding in the five senses, make up this temporal unit called the psychophysical being. When considering it and its powers, we must remember that when these 8 facets are kept in a pure state, then Kundalini Shakti loves to sport in this amazing form." So the idea of shuddhi, or purity, comes forward. And of course, purity in Vedanta means not so much focusing on morality or immorality, which should be a matter of practical sense for people. When you come to Vedanta, they figure you've already got that well in hand, but more a matter of the distance you are from the source of a thing. The further away you are from the source, the more impure something becomes. For instance, this morning in satsang here at 7:15, we were live streaming and talking about the false superimpositions. That is how nature, according to Sri Krishna in the Gita in chapter 7, is inanimate, how it's dangerous, how it's insentient, and also how it's very, very all-attracting. It's very enchanting, and how we had to disenchant ourselves from the scenes of nature, like Buddha did under the bo tree, in order to get this realization of the highest Devatma Shakti, and also the Buddha nature beyond it, the Brahman, he used to call it. He would say, the Brahman. He says that in the Dhammapada, which is the earliest of all Buddhist scriptures, written in Pali canon, and also of the Hinayana fold, that is the very earliest part of Buddhism. He often mentioned that over and over again. So he was very much aware of it. As he took teachers in Samkhya Yoga before he found his own way. So he was well schooled in the cosmology of India. Now, this quote here, we're talking about 8 facets, aren't we? That's why I put up this chart, because in that, I'm sorry to jump around a little bit here, but this is the way I teach, with lots of different angles to go at for the human mind. And the human mind is what's being taken up here. The Purastika body is what Sri Krishna talks about as being his lower nature. That is, it's insentient, it's inanimate, and it's my lower nature, he calls it. So Purastika has that Sanskrit word astika in it, which means 8. So he's talking about mind, intellect, ego, and the five senses. If you put those together, then you have what Vedanta calls a body-mind mechanism, or a psychophysical being, as I used in the quote there. But there you see Brahman at the top of this chart, undifferentiated awareness. And there you see Atmic Sankalpa, that is, that pure knower, and how it projects a form. Remember, the word pure here is being inspected from this palette of conscious future lives chart. Now, the Jivatman comes in right about there. Lord Vishishta calls him the dreamer. So he, with this power of projection, that is mind, intellect, and ego together, engage in a sort of dream life, a dream play, or a lila. At this point, it's still pure. Therefore, beings born under that auspice are being born with divine bodies. They're being born with divine senses. The kind of divine senses that Sri Krishna granted to Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, if you remember, when he got the vision of the cosmic form and Krishna touched him on the heart, and he went into a deep state of samadhi and saw the cosmic form, Vishvarupa Darshanam. So Krishna had told him previous that you cannot see God with these ordinary senses. You must have divine senses. Here, I'll grant them to you. And he touched him and gave him a very high state of awareness with this hasta diksha. Diksha is a kind of initiation, so hasta means hand. So he touched him with the hand, and with the divine intention in his mind, then awoke him to these divine senses. Those same senses which those beings who are far away from realization of Brahman are trying to purify so that they can come closer in. That's why, coming from the other direction, you're going to want to connect earth to smell, and water to taste, and fire to sight, and air to touch, and ether to hearing. So if you're coming at it from the outside in, you have to reconnect the dots, you see. I mean, I would go to a fourth chart here, but basically that's what we'll get to eventually when Jamgon Khantrul Rinpoche is talking about how you attach to the five elements. So when time of death comes, it's very difficult to detach from them. They've become familiar to you. And that's why you suffer at the time of death. You suffer dry mouth, and you suffer wavering mind, and you suffer unconsciousness, you suffer coldness of body, and these seem all very real to you. But in your first conscious death, you get over that. Look back at the palette of conscious future lives here, and look at one of these blank canvases that I painted on. Experiencing a conscious death at the end of a last lifetime. This is the penultimate goal, or the relative goal of the embodied human being. He wants to try and die consciously once. In this succession of lifetimes, he or she has forgotten each time their death. And they have when they come back into the body the next time, they also have forgotten their previous lifetime. Forgotten means smriti, bedu. Your causal memory still retains the impression of your last lifetimes, but you're not calling it forth yet. So you meditate, and that begins to uncover, that is, tear away some of the veils off of this secret that you forgot about because of an unconscious death previously. So you strip away those veils, and you begin to see this trail of your past lifetimes, which is there. And seeing that, then you have a very positive step towards your full enlightenment. So it's a penultimate stage, something that happens to every deep meditator in the process of Dhyan Yoga, meditation. So if you can have that conscious death, then the idea here is that you can be born again and have your first lifetime as a bodhisattva. That's how they would put it in Tibetan Buddhism. Actually, there are 10 lands of bodhisattva, but we'd have to go into another chart right away to show you those. We'll maybe come upon those later. there are 10 levels of bodhisattvahood, but if you can have that first conscious death and see yourself as witness to birth, life, and death before you pass away from this body that you're leaving, then you'll be able to come back and live your first conscious lifetime as a bodhisattva. We would call it in Vedanta a jivan mukta. Bodhisattva, jivan mukta, very similar terms. Living liberated souls is what they're talking about. Some of the other empty canvases there are also interesting. The one above it, spiritual practice and attainment in previous lives. They often say, that is the Rinpoches of Tibet, say that if at the time of your death you have practiced the Dharma, then it will be much easier for you to exit the body in a conscious way. So that means during life you must have, if you want to put it Vedantically, you practiced the 4 yogas. You must have meditated, you must have studied the scriptures, because the scriptures will fill you in on the wisdom of the cosmos, you see. Cosmology first, then philosophy, then spirituality. That's the sacred Triputi in Vedanta. You must know the cosmological workings of everything so that you know that you're none of them, that you're the witness or the operator of all of them. That's true knowledge, is when you know the thing, you lose fear of it, and you become awareness of how to operate it. So we're talking about operating from a conscious state. You're taking on of bodies and giving up of bodies. Like Krishna says in the Gita, like a child outgrows a set of clothes and puts on a new one, or a snake sloughs off its skin and has a new skin. So just like that, the facility of a soul to gain that kind of inner power is what the darshanas of Tibet, the darshan of Tibet, is really very much focused upon, and it's very much aligned with yoga. When Marpa brought the teachings of India across the Himalayas into Tibet and gave them to his student Milarepa, then he brought them from 2 Indian yogis. And so yoga was a very big part of Buddhism, and so was Tantra. So you have pretty much Tibetan Buddhism, this wonderful hybrid of yoga and Tantra and Buddhism. And Tibet throwing in its own touch with the Buddha fields and the Bon religion and everything that was prevalent at the time when he brought those teachings forth. So you have this very rich tradition, about 700 AD, that now has been practicing this art for 1,300 years. That's a long time to be dedicated to the teachings of a great soul like Lord Buddha. And over 1,300 years, something must have happened, you see. Something has to happen when you concentrate that long. Well, that's what I'm saying. One of the great facets of Tibetan Buddhism is this spotlight that is cast upon reincarnation. And not just that it's a negative thing, because we know that if you fall under problems with the nidanas, these links of a chain of rebirth with its 12 links, which we'll get to later as well, then you fall under a 3-lifetime auspice of bondage. It takes you 3 lifetimes, according to that Buddhist teaching. And a lifetime to recognize the karma that you've made, and a lifetime to work it out, and a lifetime to get free. So at least that's a view of one of the Buddhist schools, that it's not that easy just to become a Buddha or to become a living liberated soul. So therefore, back to this empty canvas here, spiritual practice and attainment in previous lives is going to be a great key. So guess what? You must start practicing now. Now's the time, and now's also the time to teach your children. That's very, very important in our tradition, although it isn't brought up much. Nonetheless, it's an underlying factor that should be accented, that the children should start getting the teachings of the Dharma. I often talk about several of my students around the United States. What do you want? And they say, well, if I can't get enlightenment in this lifetime, I want to be born next time with dharmic parents. you can go into a huge auditorium filled with people, thousands of people, and asked for a show of hands. How many of you had dharmic parents? In America, you probably won't see very many hands going up. You might have had, if you're lucky, moral and ethical parents, or you might have had good parents, happy parents, or parents that fought, or parents that gave you a bad upbringing. All sorts of different varieties of parenting and upbringing there to be dealt with, as we know, because as teachers we're hearing a lot about that. We should be hearing from you, who am I, who am I? And instead we're hearing, why me, why me? So there's a lot of problems in upbringing here that have cropped up, and you can cast the blame, if you will, back on this ignorance of our previous lifetimes. Actually, we're walking around with the previous lifetimes on our very features. We don't know, and I don't think the youth of the 60s took it very far. Myself, when he said, look in the mirror at your own face, it probably had some sort of idea of vanity in there. But if you actually look in the mirror, you should be studying with your discrimination what my face is shaped like, how far apart my eyes are, what my ears look like, what shape my chin is, and how big is the cranial vault, or how small, and so forth. By a study of your own features, you're just really reading the karma, a sort of spiritual physiognomy that is there on your features, that spiritual teachers know how to read. If you walked into the room with Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa in the 1800s at the Kali Temple, he'd know pretty much who you were before you crossed the room, by the way you walked, the way you conducted yourself, and as you got closer, the way your features looked. He'd know what was bothering you, and he'd know what your positive qualities are, all before you spoke a word. So that kind of masterful readership of the appearance of a human soul, that is the purastika body, is there to see because they have opened their inner eye of wisdom. Jnana chakshu, or thine eye has become single, and now shalt know the truth. So that has all happened according to a certain lifetime. I mean, you probably couldn't assign it to avatars and to nityasiddhas. They were always perfect. They always knew their true nature. But to those beings that people the many realms of the 7 lokas, or the 14 spheres of existence, the 3 worlds, however you want to put it in different teachings, they then have these projections going all the time, this kind of dream life. You see, the jivatman has become the dreamer. He's using a kind of sankalpa, projection of consciousness, to fashion body after body in space and time. And if it's done, if these are kept pure, the quote said, the mind, the ego, the intellect, and the 5 senses are kept pure, then the body is also pure, and they live a life of divine sport. That's called lila. If they're not kept pure, that is, if forgetfulness sets in, and they begin to attach the senses to the objects, and therefore the senses become impure with desire, with attachment, and with the suffering that follows, and then finally a memory of suffering. Then when you think back in your next lifetime, all you remember is suffering. The suffering, what I'm saying here is the suffering that you're undergoing right now is the suffering of a previous lifetime. It's not the suffering of this lifetime at all. Most of it is all the suffering of a previous lifetime, and that means you need to acknowledge it, see, and then neutralize it or attenuate it in some way. The beings do that with practice. That is, these realized souls have practice in a previous lifetime, which is what this canvas says to us. So they attain jivan mukti, liberation in a past lifetime, as the upper left-hand canvas says. And the lower left-hand canvas, they develop sincere compassion to help all beings gain spiritual emancipation. Like our Swami Vivekananda. He said, I might find it very good to get up and out of my body when I drop this body. He did it at 39 years of age. But I will never stop working. I will take on 1,000 births if I can only help one person get free. And that's a paraphrase of his that I'm using. So that kind of dedication is very important to them, and it's out of a sincere compassion that they do that. With those 4 canvases there, that you can see the kind of dedication they have, but it has to be based on having that one conscious death that leads to that one enlightened birth. With that kind of dedication, that kind of sincerity, and that kind of wisdom. Well, let's, so we don't feel too disjointed here, finish a chart that we've started. The palette chart is actually taking us to different areas that we can draw on in this subject, in this first half of this class, but you can see here how Lord Vashishta puts it. Both Krishna and Vashishta, being very, very ancient, talked about Parastika body or eightfold body. You can see here how he explains it. The Jivatman, by belief in its own separate existence, becomes the ego. It has to separate itself out like a jar of water from a lake and cap it off. See, now, same water in the lake, same water in the jar. Or sometimes they use earthen wood pot with air in it, and then the air outside. However you want to say, it's metaphorically speaking, it means that there's been this apparent separation from the whole of a part. It's a qualified non-dualistic teaching, because there is no separation in Brahman. So you have to come down to a qualified, they call it Vashishta Dvaita level, to understand it or to apply it. And so by belief in its own separate existence, it becomes the ego. Then, and this is, remember, you're talking about a kind of dream projection here. You can't really separate anything, yourself from Brahman. You're dreaming yourself away, is one way of putting it. And then how about for the manas, mind? Through dual contemplation of itself, it forms a mind. So now it starts thinking of itself as not I and my Father are one, but I and my Father are two. And that begins the manas. You see, manas is dual mind. That is one of the fourfold aspects of mind. It's accompanied with good and bad, pleasure and pain, life and death, virtue and vice, and all the way up to bondage and liberation, form and formlessness. Those kinds of dualities are a part of the dual mind. Remember, the whole universe is going to be fashioned out of this complex. So what kind of universe do you want to create? All the Indian folds take exception to ideas like a 7-day creation theory or a 4,320,000,000 year long evolutionary theory. They say, no, that's not going to cut it. The mind is manufacturing the universe. This is a prevalent teaching in the Diamond Cutter Sutra of Zen Buddhism, and all Buddhist schools follow it, especially those schools that are masterminded by Nagarjuna, one of the greatest of all Buddhist philosophers. And the Tibetan Buddhists have picked it up and called it and culled it into their Mahamudra teaching. See, well, you must know the view is this, that universe is mind made manifest. So they start off with that rule of thumb. They don't think in terms of something got created, or in 7 days, or that nature somehow did it all itself. There was many other forces in action, many other causes to the effect that they call prakriti, or nature. Prakriti and Purusha, that's why that duality is so important. Soul and nature is another duality that you contemplate. So just by very contemplation, this Jivatman, who is invested with Atmic power, Devatma Shaktim, if you want to call it that, forms an ego and forms a mind for itself. It also forms a sheath called intellect, which, remember, is different than intelligence. Intellect's the container, and intelligence is that free-flowing sentiency that visits it, we hope. So, via certitude of its own intelligence, the buddhi is formed. That is, where there's a essence, there must be a container for it. So, intellect would be that for intelligence. Then the five senses, in awareness of the five elements. So you see how Vashishta doesn't leave the five elements out of the quotient. In fact, five elements are going to congeal when the body comes forward. Deha, physical body, that is, means deha. So by awareness of the five elements, the five senses are there. So they roll out of each other in a five quintuplication process, as we're saying. And finally, the body by brooding on matter and objects. So if you put this dream power into a package like this, it's going to start to brood on matter and objects will form. And then it'll form another object called deha, physical body. It'll get into it and it'll start to sport in physical matter. It'll start to sport in nature. Now, if the important part of the quote on this chart that we're looking at is that you must remember when we consider embodiment, he means, that when these 8 facets are kept pure, then the Shakti likes to sport in that body. If they're impure, she won't go near it. Here we see a great difference between Lila Sankalpa or Atmic Sankalpa and Maya Sankalpa, or Samsara, Nirvana and Samsara, or liberation and bondage, however you want to put it. And the souls that fall under that regime, that is thousands and hundreds and thousands of souls flowing towards enlightenment and many, many more flowing towards bondage in cycles, always in cycles. That which Buddha wanted off of that wheel, that Kala Chakra, he called it. Now, this chart takes a different direction than this chart does. This is my palette for conscious future lives. This is what I want people to think about. Some of the powers that you want to avail yourself of in order to prepare yourself for leaving the body and coming back in consciousness, if you should come back at all. Deha is an interesting word. There's another word called videha, which means no bodies. So there's always that option. You can give up all bodies and never enter into this process again. They're called the Videha Muktis. And up here you saw the Jivan Mukti, the Jivan Muktas, you see, in the upper right left-hand corner. So those are 2 different kinds of souls. Those who will come back to embodiment free, and those who will live once and never come back again. They're going to merge forever into the ocean of consciousness, like a hailstone falling into an ocean, Shankara says. So if you enter into this dream process, this sankalpic process, if the senses and body and mind are kept pure, then Kundalini will come with you. She will sport in you. And then that means you're living a dharmic life, a divine life. But if not, then this is where suffering begins, the inception of suffering. See, and like the links of this chain that we look at, basically. The Nidan, as they're called, start to form, and then it's a 3-lifetime scenario for the soul to try and get out of this process. Unless, usually by the grace of a great soul, they can get out quicker, or by the grace of God or Mother. But basically, under their own power and auspice, if they have spiritual practice and attainment to their credit merits, then they can work themselves out of bondage. If not, then here you see Vashishta's description of what happens. Sankalpa, Vikalpa, dream life begins. Then karma bandha, bondage to the realm of cause and effect. That word almost sounds like the English word bondage. Bandha means the same thing. Then samskaras and samskara skandhas form. Those are impressions in the mind. That is, the impressions of your suffering, I was just telling you, are still there in your mind from a last lifetime, so you're still holding them. And the impressions of happiness and pleasure are still there. These are part of the links too, the nidanas, that bind you into that chain of rebirth. So these are the kind of things that the meditator is looking to dissolve, to disintegrate, all the way back to the inception of taking an individual body, individual soul, individual mind. He wants to always keep that process pure. See? So that he's not thinking, I'm the mind, I'm the body, I'm the intellect, I'm the ego. He's thinking, these are just stations that consciousness mans, and it can also leave them. In fact, they get so adept that they can leave them in meditation. There was a story once of Sri Sharda Devi went meditating with her husband, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, and they left the body completely and went inward to this very beautiful set of realms that they visited. She said they were like flying over them, inward flight. And then when it came time to return to the body, she looked outward and saw her body there, and she said it was a vile thing. She was in her 20s probably, still young and healthy, but she didn't want to get into the body. She wanted to stay free. So this gives us an idea of when these nadis, or these channels of divine spiritual energy, are open, or if you can open them at will in meditation, then you have this marvelous facility to visit the kingdoms of heaven within you. That's how Christ put it very simply. And also come back to the body, and that's only happening under the auspice of a person with pure senses and pure mind. It's not happening otherwise. Otherwise, it gets into samskaras. Samskaras are like, there we are. Samskaras are like mental impressions that are the cause of embodiment. You see a basic brain, but the brain is just the physical representation of what's called a mind. And the mind has stored inside of it all these little, in fact these are Tibetan Buddhist clouds, so it's a very apropos way of illustrating it. You can see on the more negative side of the samskaras, since we came to it in the chart here, negative samskaras based on desire. You can see a root ignorance, tendency towards cyclic transmigration. There's a great samskara in people's minds. They have no knowledge of their true self when they lived previously. They didn't practice Dharma. They didn't realize spiritual life. They didn't meditate. And they just lived basically in the senses and in matter. And so that's called root ignorance. A word for it in Sanskrit is mula vidya, root ignorance. Not just avidya, which is general overall ignorance, but root ignorance, mula vidya. And also the tendency towards cyclic transmigration or rebirth comes about. And that would be this process that we're talking about here on this chart. There's another samskara there, so birth, gender, life, personality, death, rebirth, also there. Look at your chart now here for a second. Right above the palate in the middle, choosing dharmic parents prior to entering into the womb, selecting the country and culture of one's choice, assuming gender and physical body, arranging life circumstances in order to neutralize karma, setting up the manifestation of one's work and mission in life. Those are almost complete our canvases, you see. So these are some of the things that are possible for the soul who is aware of all of this power. Otherwise, this birth, gender, life, personality, death, and rebirth is all done by chance, sort of like roulette wheel method, you see, where everything is given to chance and your consciousness doesn't have any ability to choose. What this palette of conscious rebirth is speaking about is developing the power of choice. You choose your parents, and you would choose your gender, you would choose the country of your birth, as Dalai Lama did 13 or 14 lifetimes in a row. He was never far from the mark, was he, when he came into his incarnations. So that power of choice is there in the soul, and it can get very well honed inside of the mental body. Mind, ego, and intellect. The ego there is ripe ego, so it's not getting in the way of the process. There's a marvelous facility and openness there, and an ability to travel inwardly on these subtle nadis, yoga calls them, subtle nerves. And as Aurobindo said, up and down the amber stairs of birth and death. That's one of the quotes he used. Here you see some other examples. Desire for pleasure and power is also a samskara in people. That is, craving, ego obsession, urge to dominate, and body identification are thickening the pot. That is, thickening the stew of reincarnation and cyclic transmigration. So it becomes very difficult for a person to see where they've been or to know where they're going, and based on not knowing who they are. They think that they're the impure senses. You see, the mind, body, and 5 senses are all impure, so impure there means ignorant of its true nature. And these are some of the things that would then manifest. There's a definition of samskara, a mental impression formed via desire-based actions with a propensity for causing rebirth. I wish we could put that in the dictionary, in the English dictionary. Then we would have a word in our language. We'd have to borrow it from Sanskrit, of course, but we'd have a word for this that would then create a space in our mind to begin to consider it. This is basically what this is a consideration of things that have been going on for thousands of years, but which we're not really taking that seriously yet. We're just entertaining thoughts about it, but we're not actually manning the stations and trying to practice as this canvas says. At this level, you start to get into mixed samskaras: agency, name and fame, selfishness, attraction to wealth, lassitude. Those also come forward from past lifetimes. As if you've been attached to wealth in a previous lifetime, then you're probably born with wealthy parents again and have that same attachment. It's very hard to rid yourself of that until you finally get the spirit of renunciation and begin to seek freedom. That's a mixed samskara on the negative side. A mixed samskara on the positive side would be gaining energy, getting morality, gaining a proper orientation, which, by the way, is one of the Eightfold Path of Buddha. Ashtangika Marga, he calls it. And developing a sense of altruism. And basically you begin to lose your selfishness bit by bit, and you begin to gain selflessness. And it begins to take its place. When that happens, you see the turning point from an ignorant soul to a potential bodhisattva or a potential jivan mukta. They're on the road, on the way to freedom. Vedanta, the voice of freedom, has been heard. So you're looking basically here, tendencies of ignorance, desire for pleasure and power, habits and attachments. Then all of a sudden you start looking towards actions, merits, and deeds. Sounds like karma, doesn't it? And mental capacity and intelligence, and abilities for divine life and conscious embodiment. This is what samskaras are like in the human mind. And some of them have been accented, and many lifetimes have been formed around them. Other lifetimes, other of them maybe haven't been present in some lifetimes, so they're buried very deep. Some examples are aptitude for higher learning, positivity, religious faith, and service, wisdom, compassion, peace, and illumination. These are things that begin to outline for us and define positive samskaras in us, so that we can see that in ourselves, we can see that in others, and hopefully we can see it in our children and begin to water those flowers and keep water away from the weeds. Prati paksha bhavanam. You water the flowers and not the weeds. If you do that in a young soul, because a young soul has all of this, every mind has all of this, even Jesus' mind has all of this, Buddha's mind had all of this. That's the nature of mind. It's dual by nature. As soon as you form a mind, it's a mechanism that separates you from Brahman. So, body formed, already error. It's like good Zen koan, you see. Body formed, already error. So at least keep the body and senses pure. And then Kundalini might come sport in you like she did in Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. And we know what kind of lifetime he lived and how beneficial it was for others. So I took a little bit of a deviation away to this samskara chart. Let's work our way back to here because we're going to hell right now. So we don't want to miss out on this. Keep your eyes open. You remember Yudhishthira is the oldest of the Pandava brothers in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna's oldest brother. And he was the most dharmic man alive. He didn't really need to hear Krishna's discourse on the battlefield. Arjuna needed to hear that. But so he was once so dharmic, in his lifetime he told one white lie. It's a good English expression. So he told one white lie. So his fate for doing that, because one white lie against the backdrop of such a perfect soul like Yudhishthira is a huge thing, you see. So instead of going to hell, he had to go through hell. That was his, he had to see all the suffering, you see. So follow along here and I'll take you through hell. You don't have to go to it. After samskaras like this form, then Mayik Sankalpa is in full operation. There you see the game is really afoot, and the covering power of Shakti, called Avarana and Vikshepa, is in full force. That is, everything is getting distorted so that you're not seeing it as it truly is, and those things that you really want to see are getting covered. That's called the power of Vikshepa and the power of Avarana. Two forms of Maya have kicked in, and it's very, very difficult to then see your way clear. Prakasha Shakti will be your only recourse. Prakasha means revelation, and so you can see, even especially in Judaism, in the Old Testament and so forth, the power of revelation was like the main thing. Revelation isn't the main thing in Vedanta, it's a step along the way, but still, revelation is a very high level, because Prakasha Shakti means to reveal, to unfold, is going to start stripping away veils and taking away coverings, disintegrating coverings. It's the fire of yoga, Shankara says, that brings about the revelatory power. So you're back to spiritual attainment in this previous life, in a previous life. You see, you should have been practicing. And that's, of course, what the Rinpoche will tell you on your deathbed. Did you practice? No. Well, then I'll help you. I'll guide you through this process. Pay attention. But if you had practiced, then you probably wouldn't even need the Rinpoche there at your bedside to guide you through. Not that any of us have a pet Rinpoche somewhere in the back room, you see, that we can say, have on call, you see. You never know when death is going to come. So this Mayik Sankalpa, conjuring up of more dream lives in relativity. Mayik Sankalpa. Remember, contrasting it to Atmik Sankalpa, which is how Buddha and Christ and Krishna and others would bring themselves into the body. Loka Sangraha. I'm coming here for the good of all the worlds. I have nothing to attain. There's no reason I should take on a body. In fact, it's a great sacrifice. It's a huge yagya to come to earth. They'll want to poison me there. They'll want to crucify me there. There's so many things that are going to happen to me. I'm going to take on this sacrifice. I'm going to come down by the force of my own Atmik Sankalpa and inject myself into the stream of their consciousness. And that stream is a mind stream. It's not a nature stream. Nature is living by mind. You can see how the order takes place in a simple chart like this. This is a simple version of the 24 cosmic principles, really. A simplified version of it. That Lord Vashishta is giving to a teenage soul named Ramchandra. He's teaching this to Ramchandra. That is, you know Sri Ram, right? Beautiful songs about Sri Ram that we could sing. So, conjuring up more dream lamps in relativity, Mike Sankalpa has kicked in. Atmic Sankalpa has been forgotten. That will descend further into what's called Vivarta or Adhyasa, false belief in the actuality of the universe in space and time. Here's where Vedanta wants to get in, you see, and say, let's reverse that process. Let's tear off these Maya coverings. Let's purify these samskaras, and let's tear the veils off of this Vivarta process. Vivarta means false superimposition of form over formlessness. It's not put in a religious way. It's not put in a moral, amoral way, like a devil is there at the hub of it trying to muddle things up for you. It's put in a very straightforward way that the covering power happens. Chit happens, you see. Chit happens, right? So when chit happens, the mind's thoughts, then the covering power starts into operation. That's called distortion and covering. Avarana, Vikshepa and Avarana Shakti. So the Vivarta is false superimposition. That's the best two words we can think of in English for it. As Sri Ramakrishna said, those people who live enough lifetimes believing the world to be real, then they will come back again and again to live many lifetimes. Those who see through the world, through the distortion and through the covering, immediately give up the world. They don't believe it to be real, in other words. The monks do that internally and externally. The householders do that internally. So if you have a person with pure senses who's a householder, one of the questions this morning, live streaming on our satsang, was, how do I live a spiritual life as a householder? And I'm not a monk. And I gave several answers to that and several stories from Sri Ramakrishna about that. So if the householder can keep his parastika body pure via the power of his practice, spiritual attainment and so forth, then he can live a divine life, can live a dharmic life. And what can I say other than the Upanishads were written by householders? The most sacred scriptures in the world were written by householders, not by monks. Of course, some of those householders took to sannyas. Whatever the case may be, they were living in the midst of family and teaching their children the Dharma. Teach your children well, as we say in the West nowadays, right? So teaching them well means to teach them the Dharma so that you want them free. You want them to have a choice whether or not they want to come back to the body or not, whether they want to deal with money and wives and husbands and children or not, whether they want to be an intellectual or not. You want them to have a choice between Atmic Sankalpa and Mayik Sankalpa. You want to help free them. As Christ said, they're not your children, they're souls under your care. So where did this possessiveness come in, you see? It came in this process of hellish existence. Mula vidya, root ignorance. Finally there you see at the very bottom, avidya. That is the first of the 5 hells. So if you started here and you had some paper to extend down there to the floor, you could put avidya, and then after that you could put egotism. I'll give you the English. Ignorance, egotism, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life. So it would be avidya, asmita, raga, dveshau, and avinibesha. The 5 hells, according to Father of Yoga, Patanjali. 5 hells. So ignorance of your true nature is the first hell. When it kicks in, then samsara cycle is well in motion, and hundreds and thousands of souls at many different levels of being are getting sucked into it. A wheel of birth and death in ignorance. But visiting the realms of name and form with pure Purastika body, there's a challenge, and there's an ideal to strive for. Yes, a penultimate ideal, because karma and reincarnation are nonsense. I just want to say that right now. They don't happen. They seem to happen. Didn't I say it was all dreamlike? So wake up. And when you wake up, that's called enlightenment. And then you have choice. You have a choice to be a Videha mukta, freedom from all bodies, or you can be a jivan mukta. Come again as many times as you want to help others, or a bodhisattva, but always remain free. In fact, both of those are spiritual arts that we need to look at. The only other canvas we didn't read here was this non-dual perspective that transforms all appearances into reality. That's at the lower right-hand corner. It transforms all appearances into reality. I've often said you could put somebody like Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa right here and put a very worldly person right next to him, and you could hardly tell the difference, see. Same body, same elements, same blood, same flesh, same brain, same eyes, same senses, same. So what's the difference between the two? One is completely non-attached and free and in bliss, and the other's completely attached in bondage and suffering, or going from suffering, pleasure to pain, back and forth in cycles all the time, like a fly that can't decide whether to light on a flower or excrement. See? Can't decide where to land. So in the same way, then, this idea of sameness is there in Zen Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and Vedanta and Advaita Vedanta. They call it every man's consciousness in Zen. And it's very hard to tell the difference between somebody who's in every man's consciousness and somebody who's in samadhi, in a higher state. They call it satori in that tradition. Usho, divine nature, what we call Atman. So that sameness, what I'm talking about here in terms of this little piece of information, is that all of this that seems like Maya, to the enlightened soul, this is all Brahman. It's like a blind man took some collyrium and spread it in there and all of a sudden could see. Some soul took some spiritual collyrium and spread it on his eyes, and all of a sudden where he was seeing Maya, all of a sudden he sees nothing but God everywhere. In an instant. So that kind of revelation, again, Prakasha Shakti, is open to the soul who courses inward, who wants to master the kingdoms of heaven within, or who wants to come to know the 24 cosmic principles in fives, or we call it 25 if you want. So that final canvas, before we have our break here at the first half, is painted with that non-dual perspective that sort of knits the rest of this all together. Let's look at them again. Choose dharmic parents prior to entering into the womb. We'll get into that a little bit after the break with a Tibetan Buddhist teaching. Select the country and culture of your choice. Dalai Lama did it, other people do it. You know, there's also probably a very good likelihood that most of us did it, but we forgot. And our choice was mixed. Our standard wasn't that high. Our capacity wasn't that powerful. Because what we didn't look at here in this palette chart, if you can see the palette itself, look at the different paints. The paints you're using to get freedom are pure will, cosmic wisdom, clear mind, strong intention, spiritual adeptship, and farsightedness. These are things that you're going to be painting with if you enter into this process of body embodiment. You're talking about conscious embodiment, so it has to be conscious disembodiment too. You can't get into life and say, this is my oyster, the world's my oyster, all of this is going well, and all of a sudden, oh, death comes. Now what happens? I should have met death a long time ago. I should have known death from my previous death. See, I should have known that I was the observer of birth, life, and death all the time. That I've seen myself live, be born, and die many times, but I've never changed. That all-seeing eye has never changed as it watched the passing of all phenomena. So, put it this way, Sri Ramakrishna's story. The potter puts its pots in the sun to dry, both baked and unbaked ones. A cow happens to walk over them and breaks some of them. The baked pot shards that are broken he throws away, but the soft ones, though broken, he gathers up and shapes them into a lump. From this lump he forms new pots. In the same way, so long as a man does not realize God, he will have to come back to earth, that is, to the potter's hands again. So Sri Ramakrishna saw village life, things happening out in the world, and just immediately saw the spiritual essence in everything. There wasn't everything he saw, did, tasted, smelled, everything he experienced with his own pure body and senses was simply a spiritual teaching happening in front of him. And so he translated it into words. So the potter's hand, you see, the potter's hand is really your own. Where seekest thou that freedom, friend? Neither this nor that can give. In books and temples vain thy search. Thine only is the hand that holds the rope that drags thee on. Then cease lament, let go thy hold, Sannyasin bold, say Om Tat Sat Om. So thine only is the hand that holds the rope that drags thee on, Swamiji said in his great poem. So then we must cease lament and let go thy hold. So all of this chart, which I've handed to you here and which the live streaming audience has been able to look at up close, is all about let go thy hold and begin to plan, become a better artist, see, a better potter, a better painter, a better musician, and definitely a better spiritual artisan, someone who can choose wisely and who takes responsibility for their choices in life, therefore will annul their karma or neutralize it or at least attenuate it so that it won't be a botheration. And so greater knowledge can be gained in each lifetime. Better and better births, Sri Aurobindo said in his Lights on Yoga. Better and better birth, higher and higher births. That's a penultimate goal to reach for until such a time when you can see that all coming and going, all dreaming is nonsense, and you give it up. That's your true nature looking on. To this playful process. But this playful process can also become a very painful process. So we looked at Samskaras, we looked at the palette of conscious future births. Let's read the final quote to finish this chart. Human being, today it is, tomorrow it is not. No one will accompany a person after death. Only actions, good and bad, follow even after death. The result of karma is inevitable. But karma's effects can be counteracted greatly by japa and austerities. Sri Sharda Devi, the Holy Mother, my teacher's teacher. So we see by her quote that she sobers us, but then she also tells us the way out. It's the way the Noble Truths proceed. There is suffering, there's a cause for suffering, there's a way out of suffering, and this is it, the Eightfold Path. Begins with right orientation and right perspective. So those very teachings in the Eightfold Path of the Buddha that found its way into Tibet and China and Japan and so forth are right out of Mother India. And they're the same teachings that we teach in Vedanta and Yoga and Sankhya and Tantra. And with those teachings, the soul gets well manned, see, and is able to make choices that are wise and freeing, and live a life which is beneficial to himself and to all other beings. So after our break then, we will come back and look at the teachings of Tibetan Buddhism on conscious death, and therefore leading to conscious rebirth. So thank you all for your attentions in this first half. Om Sato ma Sadgamoya Tamaso ma Joy Tirgamoya Mrichor ma Amritam Gamaya Abhira Mayenti Rudrayate Dakshinamukam Tenamam Pahinicham Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Lead us from darkness to light, from lower truth to higher truth, from the unreal to the real, and from the illusion of death to eternal life. Reach us through and through, O Lord and Mother, with thy sweet and benign presence. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om.